Well, good day. I'm Abby Almy. I live here in New Bedford, and I'm quite honored to finally meet you, Mr. Douglas. Perhaps you could tell me a little bit about how you got here to New Bedford and why New Bedford?
Well, it's indeed a pleasure, Mrs. Alby, to be talking to you this evening through the advent of technology. And certainly, well, how did I get here? Certainly, I escaped from Baltimore for my master, Hugh All. I think it was the 3rd of September. I had promised myself that when the month of September left, that I would be a free man. And so I can say this now with clarity and without suspicion that my future wife, Anna Mary, who I met in Baltimore, helped me escape by selling her bedpost and having money for my train and sewing a sailor suit. And so I dressed up as a sailor and I had sailor papers and I caught a train out of Baltimore through Havre de Grace, Maryland, and then to Wilmington, and then to New York. And then once I arrived in New York, which was quite a harrowing experience, to say the least, because it was a very dangerous place for a runaway that you could hardly trust anyone. So I was able to connect with then one of the masters of the Underground Railroad, Mr. Ruggles. And in telling Mr. Ruggles about some of my skills as a ship's caulker, he was the one who suggested I come to New Bedford. Mm-hmm. He was quite certain that with my skills as a ship's caulker that I learned in the shipyards of Fells Point, Baltimore, that I would be able to find and make a living in New Bedford. And so after he introduced us, Anna and I, to Reverend Pennington, and we got married, and then we made our way to New Bedford. And so I give the credit to Mr. Ruggles.
Yeah. And of course, when you arrived, I'm sure you needed to change your name, as so many people here in New Bedford did. Not only did people escaping slavery change their names, but a number of the men working on the ships changed their name because it was either too long and difficult for the captain to pronounce, or perhaps they just decided they'd rather have a name like Joseph or Joe as opposed to Juan, so they would change their name. And so how did you come about with the name Douglas?
Well, as you might know from my narrative and my history, that I was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. My paternal name, Washington, my maternal name, Bailey. And so I was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. In which I soon dropped my middle names, Augustus and Washington, and was just known as Frederick Bailey. And then during my escape from Baltimore, I changed my name to Frederick Johnson, which, as you say, many of us did in our escape. And so arriving in New Bedford as Frederick, Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Johnson, at the home there on 7th Street of Nathan and Polly Johnson, and then finding out that the name Johnson was quite prevalent in New Bedford, Mr. Johnson said, I think you might want to find a new name, and I would take it an honor to give you your new last name. And so without having any idea of what I might call myself on my own, I certainly gave him the opportunity to do that. And he was reading a great novel of the time, Lady of the Lake, in which the main character's name is Douglas. And so he said, I think it sounds quite fitting, Frederick Douglas. And so we agreed upon that. And now you know me as Frederick Douglas. Yes.
So it seems that Frederick Bailey was born a slave down in the South, and yet Frederick Douglass was born here in New Bedford as a free man.
That is true. That is very
It's a
true.
wonderful thing.
Yes, yes, yes.
Now, understand that being a caulker, you had expected, as Mr. Ruggles did, that you'd be able to find work on the piers and on the docks. However, I understand that that's not exactly what happened. You had a little difficulty with finding employment.
Yes, I certainly found this out even before I arrived in New Bedford. When I was in New York, I was entertaining the idea of perhaps staying in New York.
Mm-hmm.
My first taste of freedom, of course, was when I arrived in Philadelphia. But then when I arrived in New York, certainly I was free of slavery, but I was also free of food and lodging. Yes. And so with freedom comes some responsibility, you understand.
Absolutely.
And so without any employment to earn a wage, then you're in quite a predicament. And so, of course, when I told Mr. Ruggles about my craft, and he suggested New Bedford, he was saying, there's New Bedford is certainly open to green hands. I mean, they were an industry, a shipping industry, whaling industry, quite prosperous and everything. And so he said that they're looking for green hands in New Bedford. Well, I arrived there and my hands weren't quite as green as some of the other runaways, you understand? Mm-hmm. I had a skill. My hands were brown. and so I believe my first endeavor was to find work. And so I set out, headed to the shipyards, and walking down one of the streets there in New Bedford, noticed that there was a Presbyterian minister who had a pile of coal in his yard there. And I approached and knocked on the door and said, may I move this coal for you? And his wife responded, well, what will you charge us to move this coal? And I said, well, I'll leave that up to you. And so she said, well, move the coal. And so I moved the coal, and then she gave me my first honest wage, wow. 2 half silver dollars.
That must have felt wonderful to have your very own money.
Well, I tell you, it was a feeling like none other, because you understand, in slavery, even in Baltimore, when I was hired out by my master, Hugh All, and I was making about $9, in some cases $9 a week, as a wage. But then I had to give that to my master, and he would have the audacity to take it all from me.
Oh my!
Like a thief, like a robber. I would have to give the money to him, and then to prove in my mind that it actually belonged to me, he would occasionally hand me back 6 cents out of $6.
Oh my! Yes.
And so that's what I endured in my time in bondage. Now, this $2 half was everything to me, and I just felt overwhelmed with the opportunity to earn my own wage. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, that was just one job. And so then I went down to the docks there and found a sloop and started loading coal on the sloop and got a job there. But as you say, the atmosphere there was such that when I went to one of the other shipyards, I think it was a Mr. French who was running the shipyard there, and told me about my skills. And he said, sure, I'll put you on this ship we're building right now, and you can work alongside these men. Well, immediately, these men who were skilled laborers, white men, said, we will not lay another hand if you do anything on the ship. We will not work alongside you.
Yes, it was very difficult in those, because New Bedford is quite diverse in its population and welcoming to everyone, because of the whaling industry, of course, we need a lot of men to do all kinds of things. And
Right.
my understanding is that a lot of the Irish were working on the docks at that time, and they had struggled to find their place and being able to find employment as well. So, it was probably intimidating to them, although I don't at all condone their decision to lock you out. I do understand that a lot of that did happen with different.
No, I
people
certainly
here in New Bedford.
understand. I didn't understand quite at the time that I was being locked out, as you might say, by the Irishmen. But then, and we might get to this later in our conversation, when I ended up leaving for Liverpool and meeting the Irish, that I began to understand the Irish plight. And so it came full circle. But I would have you know that the surprising thing that I found out about New Bedford, because I had left the plantation on the Eastern Shore, and then even in Baltimore, everything that I knew about anything as far as wealth is concerned is that wealth was established by people who owned slaves. That was my perception. That slavery was the basis of all wealth in this country. And so when I arrived in New Bedford, I am stunned to see. First of all, I'm expecting to see that because the people did not have slaves, that they would be quite impoverished.
So based upon your experience, that's what you expected to see here?
That's what I expected to see when I arrived in New Bedford. But I get there, and even those people who were considered lower class or middle class had better homes than many of the slaveholders in the South. As a matter of fact, even Mr. Johnson, who was a Black man, had a better home, more books, read more newspapers, and was more informed about the political and social classes than 90% of the slaveholders in Maryland. And so it was quite stunning to see this, and it took some time to get used to.
I'm sure, yes. And were you surprised at the diversity of New Bedford, the people that came from all over the world, and the number of people of color here that lived here? Because my understanding is that here in New Bedford, the percentage of people of color was larger than in Boston and Philadelphia at the time.
Yes, I was quite surprised. And we had a community, and I became a part of that community, myself and Anna, and we were welcome into the church. And of course, just as I did in Maryland, I would teach Sabbath school. And for those who might not know how to read and write, of course, I had taught myself how to read and write. And teaching Sabbath school was certainly a way to help my brethren learn how to read and write. And so I felt quite comfortable in the fact that that I could trust my brethren. Unlike when I was in New York and traveling, I mean, there were several times, I can remember a couple of times when I thought I might be turned in by a person of color. But when I arrived in New Bedford, everyone was there to protect those who were seeking freedom. And although there were certainly some prejudices in the community, those who understood the abolitionist movement and the colored people all protected one another. And so much so, as a matter of fact, there was an incident in New Bedford where two runaways got into some sort of disagreement. And one of them threatened to tell the other master that he had ran away.
Oh my!
And so the congregation decided that they would have a meeting, and so they put out the word that they would have a meeting, nondescript, about what the meeting was about. And when everyone arrived there in the hall, they elected one of the senior deacons as the president of this meeting. And of course, the person who had made this claim or this threat, he was there as well. And so the deacon stood up and he said to the congregation, "Well, we are all here at this meeting, and I think we have him here. And I would suggest that those of you younger men take him outside and kill him."
Mm. Oh,
And of course, that caused a big ruckus in the building, and some of those young men rushed to apprehend him, and then some of those who were more docile got in the way, and he bolted from the building. And let's say, we never saw him in New Bedford again.
Yes. Well, New Bedford, never sent anyone back, and no one was ever taken back into slavery from New Bedford.
Yeah.
There was a story in the newspaper at one point that discussed a young girl who had come to New Bedford, had escaped, and was working in a boarding house. And actually, a marshal and her former owner had arrived, and there was a ruckus, and the people there staying at the boarding house was able to get between she and the marshal. And she escaped again, and the marshal was very nicely shown out of town and never to return. And the interesting thing is that in the newspaper, the headline was an attempted kidnapping, which I thought was quite interesting, given that with the fugitive slave law, they did have the right to come and take her. So we're quite proud that no one has ever been taken back into slavery from New Bedford, which is, I think, something of pride, even though I know oftentimes people talk about New Bedford being a total abolitionist town. And there are, of course, those very staunch abolitionists and very, as you had mentioned, very good community of people who protect. I, on the other hand, I think I represent a lot of people here in New Bedford with the fugitive slave law. It makes us very nervous that we could end up in jail as well by just even knowing that someone has escaped. So we spend a lot of time pretending that we don't know anything. And I think a lot of us do that. We don't absolutely protect, but we certainly aid as we can. Which I think is an important thing is that there's the whole community that will protect and help as we can.
Right. Well, you understand that, and I certainly, as I'm being introduced to the abolitionist movement, you understand I was there at the house, and a young man came and asked that I subscribe to a subscription of the Liberator.
Oh, yes.
Published by William Lloyd Garrison, and so I said I certainly would like to read this newspaper, but my means are minimal, and so he made some arrangements that I would get the paper and then pay my subscription when I could, and I started reading the Liberator as a daily bread, and started to understand the sentiment in Massachusetts, in New Bedford, led by Mr. Garrison, that they thought that they could change the nation through moral suasion.
Correct.
That they were non-voters, and so that kind of sentiment that we're going to be right on the fray and not really getting into the political fray, certainly not condoning any violence against slavery, although it was an incredibly brutal institution. And I would frequently say in my speeches, when someone might call out a rebellion, that I would say to them, the only thing worse than a rebellion is the thing that causes the rebellion. Mm. And so it took some time after my initial indoctrination into the abolition of slavery, and the fact that Mr. Garrison and the Garrisonians really thought that the Constitution was a flawed document and that it should be torn up and rewritten, that it would take some maturation for me to kind of find my own voice, you understand, and to realize eventually that the Constitution might actually be a remedy to slavery and not supporting slavery.
Now, your wife, Anna, you had mentioned that she had sold some things some of her household things in order to fund your escape. Now, once you arrived here, how did you set up a household? Did you?
Well,
you stayed with the Johnsons for a short time, I'm assuming, and then were able to find your own home?
Yes, we did. You understand that Anna was actually 5 years my senior. She was older than I. She was actually a free woman. She was, of course, born in Maryland, the first of 8 children to be born free. And so she enjoyed that privilege from her birth of being free, and was a housekeeper in Maryland. And so she had developed those skills as a housekeeper and became a marvelous housekeeper. And I frequently called her the center post of the house. If it were not for Anna, the house would have caved in on the family. And so as I was finding different jobs around New Bedford, after being turned away from the shipyards, then to find a saw and an axe and a horse and start cutting wood and chopping wood, and then also working in an oil refinery and a brass factory, all these types of jobs. She was at home sewing and washing clothes and making money that way, and being very frugal about what money came into the house. And so, of course, she also initially found her way into one of the New Bedford anti-slavery societies for women. And so she was connected there as well. So she was certainly a wonderful housekeeper and kept the house well, and eventually gave me 5 children.
Yes, and 3 of them being born here in New Bedford, correct? 3 of your children?
Yes. Well, Rosetta was the first. My daughter Rosetta was the oldest and the firstborn, and then came Lewis. And then when Frederick Jr. was born, we were actually in Lynn. And of course, because of her connections with the midwives and so forth in New Bedford, she left Lynn and came back to New Bedford for the birth of our 3rd child, Frederick Jr.
Yes. Wonderful children, it seemed. I think they admired you greatly, your children.
Well, they eventually, after they came to know me, you understand that once I became a part of the anti-slavery movement, Mr. Garrison, then that ended my days of labor, and I started speaking as a spokesperson for the abolitionist movement. And so I was traveling quite extensively. After I spoke on Nantucket Island, which was the first time I really spoke to a sizable audience, that we went on a 100 conventions tour, in which I was gone much of the time. And then while in Lynn, I left because after I drafted my first narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which brought me certainly some unwanted attention, that I would have to leave. And I left Lynn on the RMS Cambria and spent 21 months in England and Ireland. And so this goes back to proof that Anna was a powerful woman who sustained the house while I was gone and raised our children and kept the family going. So I would certainly come back home to a well-kept home and clothes well-pressed. And so when I went out, I was certainly looking quite fine. And of course, in New Bedford, which had many more luxuries and amenities than, say, even the best plantations in Maryland. I mean, they had, you didn't have to walk 100 yards to the well. The water was right at your elbow. You understand?
Right.
The wood was kept right at the house. There were washing machines and pressing machines and so forth. So this made her job much easier than she would have ever had it in Baltimore.
Mm-hmm. But one of the advantages, I think, in New Bedford too is that many of the women were used to having their husbands, fathers, sons away for extended lengths of time. And that, I think, provided a good support system also for Anna, not only with the community of people of color, but also with the women in general, knowing that many of the women had their husbands away and had to manage both finances and housekeeping and all of that on their own. And it's one of the advantages of New Bedford was that women were able to have their own money. They were able to have bank accounts. They were able to own businesses and even sign contracts, legally signed contracts here in New Bedford, which wasn't true necessarily everywhere. But that in itself is a support system, I think. So when you were away, many of the people in the community understood that she was alone and needed to raise the children and keep a household. And when you returned, it was the same as with many of us when our husbands returned. It was like having a special guest. Yes. We tried to make it very fine when our husbands returned, because you didn't know how long they would be there, and you weren't sure how long they would be gone the next time. Did you find that as well with Anna?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I except for protecting their identity and their safety, mm-hmm. By not, in my narrative and in my speeches to not, talk about them, she did quite fine on her own. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, I would say this about the women of New Bedford, and being able to just see the contrast and comparison between the women in New Bedford and other women across the nation, that you all kind of introduced me to my first idea of what women's rights could be. Mm-hmm. Because you understand, eventually I became a woman's rights man and stood beside Miss Anthony and Mrs. Stanton and Mrs. Mott for women's suffrage. And of course, they did not have any of those rights. As a matter of fact, they had so much privilege that they thought they had rights. It wasn't until they went into the longhouse of the Haudenosaunee and saw a matriarchal society where women were actually running things and telling men what to do, that they realized they had so much privilege that they didn't know they had rights. That anything they own, like you say, money, jewelry, and even their children were not their own. That could be taken away by their husbands as soon as he felt like he was through with the woman. So when I finally started, after I moved to Rochester, and started talking to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Grimke sisters and the list goes on and on, that I was quite comfortable because I had seen the purpose of the woman in New Bedford.
Yes, and many of those women also came and spoke here in New Bedford and were involved in the suffrage and movement here in New Bedford as well. One of the things I think that I always was horrified by with the institution of slavery, of course, there's many things to be horrified by, of course, but was the fact that your family was never really your family. Once you came to New Bedford and you had children, Was it it must have been quite a feeling knowing that no one could take those children from you, although you did feel that you needed to protect them.
Yeah.
Is that my understanding, is that you still felt that you needed to protect them?
Absolutely. I mean, pardon for me for interrupting, but I mean, you really touched a nerve in the fact that I was born, you understand, around the year 1818, taken away from my mother before I even finished nursing. It was the modus operandi of any slave master to separate a family, a child from her mother. So my mother was sold to a plantation about 12 miles away. I never saw my mother during the light of day.
Mm.
She would occasionally walk 12 miles, 24 miles round trip, just to rock me to sleep at night.
Oh,
and of course, she would have to leave before dawn to go back to her plantation to answer that bell for hard labor. And so I was fortunately raised by my grandmother, Betsy Bailey, who had already given my master, Colonel Lord, all her years. And now in the twilight of her life, she was relegated to raising small children until they were able to come to the great farm, to the great house, and start their career in bondage. And so to have that happen to you at such a young age, and to see that happening, to see families, to see whole huts left vacant by the slave trade, by the auction block, is something that you just don't get over overnight. And so those were things, even after arriving in New Bedford and being protected by a community of people, was still right in the back of my mind at all times.
So you always feared that there might be someone to come and take your children, even here in New Bedford?
Oh, of course. And so I made sure that, and even you understand, my own person, that Mr. Garrison and those in the abolitionist movement, although it took me out on this 100 conventions tour, they had to protect my person as well. I mean, I could have gotten snatched up. There was always someone looking at my back to make sure that because I was certainly bringing attention to myself that many of those in New Bedford even thought was not a wise idea. You understand? As long as I was, making my wage as everybody else was doing, most of the other colored people are working in a shipyard or in a foundry or something like that, you're kind of inconspicuous. But when you step on the platform and start making statements, as I first did at Nantucket, then you are putting yourself in quite a bit of jeopardy. Yes.
Yes, because there's always in New Bedford a way to sort of hide in plain sight. But you can't hide if you're putting yourself on a platform. Now, how did you start with your speaking? How did Mr. Garrison ever find you? How did that happen? Where were you? Did he hear you speak somewhere?
Well, yes, they had visited one of the churches in the Black community that I was speaking at quite regularly, and they offered me to join them at one of the conventions on Nantucket. And of course, I went, not even thinking that anyone knew who I was. And then after I get there, they asked me to stand up and speak. And I certainly was, it was all I could do to stand. I was shaking. I could probably not even connect 2 words of the sentences that I spoke that day. But nevertheless, I think my nervousness might have been an asset to me at that particular time. But I told my story and was certainly well received, and then was immediately followed by William Lord Garrison, who was one of the best orators I had ever heard in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, just based on the reaction of that audience, they said, we have to have you to give the authentic narrative. And I said, well, I'm telling a story that 1,000 other colored Maryland boys could have told with equal skill and effect. And so with that, I started to just start embracing the idea of being an orator. And I can remember Mr. Collins introducing me as such. He said, he is the graduate from the peculiar institution of slavery with his diploma written on his back.
Oh my.
Yes, yes, yes.
So your speaking career actually started here in a church in New Bedford.
Yes.
That's
yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now I understand I've just received a little note saying that we need to start what they call wrapping up in this new age of things here.
Yes,
so I didn't know, I understand that there was a poem perhaps you would like to recite.
About my final word for this conversation, which certainly takes me back to my time on the plantation, and is related certainly to New Bedford because they have something in common, and that is the ship. And ships had a unique meaning for me as far as any hope that I had of becoming free. You see, it was when I was sent back from Baltimore to the plantation with Mr. Colby, who was intent on breaking my spirit, that I found myself one of the worst and most depressed times in my life. I was thinking about suicide. And I can remember sitting only a few blades from his porch to the Chesapeake Bay, sitting on the bank, and seeing the ships sailing up the Chesapeake Bay north to Annapolis. And those ships represented some inkling of freedom to me, that if I could only be on one of those ships heading north and to find freedom. And so you fast forward to 1893, that I am one of the key leaders of the Chicago World's Fair in Chicago, and invite the great poet Paul Laurence Dunbar to speak and recite a poem. And he was reading a poem that day, "Ode to Ethiopia," and so it was he dazzled the audience that day at his poetic reading. But I'm sure that he had read my first narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, in which I made a feeble attempt to write a poem about my situation and the ships that were passing up the Chesapeake Bay. And then he followed after me with this wonderful poem, "Ships That Pass at Night." And he certainly did a better job than I could do. And so this is that poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, and I hope those of you who are listening in New Bedford can certainly identify and enjoy this poem, "Ships That Pass at Night." Out in the sky, the great dark clouds are massing. I look far out into the pregnant night, where I can hear a solemn booming gun that tells me the ship I seek is passing. My tearful eyes, my soul's deep hurt are glassing, for I would hail and check that ship of ships. I would stretch out hands, cry aloud. My voice falls dead a foot from thine own lips, and but its ghost doth reach that vessel, passing. O earth, O sky, O ocean still surpassing, Is there no hope for me? Is there no way that I might check and catch that speeding bark, which out of sight and sound are passing, passing? Thank you, Mrs. Almy. I certainly enjoyed this conversation with you today. And
Thank
I
you.
understand there's going to be some questions coming afterwards. And so we're certainly looking forward to that, aren't we?
Yes, and we certainly enjoyed speaking with you. And again, it was a great honor to actually meet you at this point.
Well, likewise. And let's hope we have inspired some future abolitionists, civil rights, women's suffrage in the modern era by this conversation.
Yes, I understand the struggle continues.
Yes.
Thank you again.
Good day to you.